Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the History Cloak channel. I'm Mr. McGee. On today's episode, we are going to focus on the legislative branch, which is Article 1 of the Constitution. Now, in our Founding Fathers' minds, the legislative branch was supposed to be the most important branch of government because it was the people's branch. The people directly elect their representatives, and those representatives make law. So because of that, the legislative branch has far more sections in Article 1 of the Constitution than the executive branch, Article 2, or the judicial branch, Article 3. The legislative branch is supremely important. Now, by the way, that's not to say that the other branches are not important. So as we go through the legislative branch, you're going to see some rules that you recognize, maybe some that you kind of knew but weren't sure about, and you'll learn some new rules that you didn't even know were connected to the legislative branch. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's begin. Now, Article 1 of the Constitution has 10 sections to it. Now, to keep this video from being 2 hours long, what I'm going to do is give you the highlights of each section. I'm going to skip some of the more minute details of each section, but I'm going to give you an overview and focus on some of the more important aspects of each section. Remember, the goal is for you to read the Constitution yourself, so I hope that you will do that, especially if you watch the executive branch episode already. So with that understanding established, let's take a look at Section 1 of Article 1. Section 1 is really simple. The legislative branch will consist of the House of Representatives and the Senate. So in other words, two houses will make up the legislature. And if you've ever watched School of Rock, or if you listened to anything in school up to this point, you will know that in order for the president to either sign a bill into law or veto a bill, that bill has to pass through both houses of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The only difference with those two houses is that the House of Representatives is based on population. So the larger your state, the more representatives you get. Whereas in the Senate is based on equal representation. So every state gets 2 senators. This goes back to debates during the making of the Constitution in which the large states wanted representation based on population and the small states wanted equal representation. And basically, the Constitutional Convention was at a standstill until the Great Compromise, also called the Connecticut Compromise, came into being. Hey, instead of having to do one or the other, why don't we have a legislature that does both? Hence, House of Representatives and the Senate. Section 2 of Article 1 of the Constitution basically gives the rules for what you have to do in order to be a member of the House of Representatives. So, you have to be 25 years old, you have to have been a citizen of the United States for at least 7 years. You also have to be a resident of the state in which you are a representative for the particular district in that state. Also, the House of Representatives term is only 2 years long. That means that every 2 years, all 435 members of the House of Representatives are up for election. So that allows for drastic swings in who controls the House because all the members' seats are up for grabs every 2 years. Section 2 also states that the House of Representatives is the House that has the power of impeachment, which we should note. When we say impeach, all that means is the House's job is to vote on and determine if there is enough evidence to go to trial. So you can have a president that is impeached, but that doesn't mean that they're guilty. It's kind of like the word indict. In court, if a person is indicted for a crime, that just means there's enough evidence to go to trial. It doesn't mean that they're actually guilty or innocent of the crime. Now, a second note should also be added as well. If you read Section 2, you will notice this weird thing called the 3/5 compromise. In other words, 3 out of every 5 slaves can be counted for the purposes of taxation and representation. Now, needless to say, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolishes slavery. So, back in the days of the Constitutional Convention, obviously slavery existed in the United States. It also existed all over the planet. But, since we're talking about the Constitution, we'll talk about what was going on at the convention. Well, at the convention, to make a long story short, the South had this wonderful idea that, hey, you know what? Slaves, they're not even human beings. They're just property. So when it comes to how much taxes we have to pay as a state, don't count slaves as part of the population, because the larger your population is, the more taxes you have to pay. But the South said, hey, when it comes to how many representatives we get, then, hey, magically, all the slaves are human beings and they should all be counted as part of our population. Well, as you can probably guess, many of the northern states, not to mention the abolitionists who lived in those northern states, said, no, absolutely not. Now, here's the question. You have to have a country, one whole country. You can't have splits at the beginning of your country. So what is the compromise that you can make? And the compromise was, okay, you can count 60% of your slaves, or 3/5, as part of the population for both taxation and representation. So that's why the 3/5 compromise is in there. Now, Mr. McGee will add a triple note to this. For whatever reason, it has become popular to say something like this. Well, hey, you know what? The 3/5 compromise, this is terrible because they counted slaves as only 3/5 of a human being. That's all they thought that they were worth. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not why the 3/5 compromise exists. The goal was how many slaves get to be counted in terms of taxation and representation. If you want another way of thinking about it, think of it like this. If I had a classroom of 30 students and my principal said, hey, pick 15 students to do a survey. Well, that's half the class. So if I pick 15 students out of that class, does that mean that I only believe that my class is half of a human being? Well, no. It deals with accounting. Nothing more, nothing less. So it's very important not to go with kind of popular terms that lack context. Now, Section 3 deals with what do you need to do to be a member of the Senate? Now, they are a little bit different from the House of Representatives because a Senate term is 6 years long. And also, you have less senators. So in order to be a senator, you have to be at least 30 years old. You have to have been a citizen in the United States for at least 9 years. And of course, you need to actually live in the state that you are representing as a senator. Now, on top of that, the Vice President of the United States is head of the Senate. The Vice President will deal with some procedural things in the Senate, but he or she can only cast a vote if the vote is tied. Remember, every state gets 2 senators, so you could wind up with a tie vote. Now, there's also a person called the President Pro Tempore. All that means is, in case the Vice President is away traveling through Mongolia or something, the President Pro Tempore, normally selected from the majority party, that person's job is to do all the procedural roles that the Vice President would have done had the Vice President been there. Also, the President Pro Tempore cannot cast a tie-breaking vote since the President Pro Tempore is already a member of the Senate and has a vote. Also, one more important note is that the Senate has the power of convicting the president or exonerating the president. So remember how the House gets the power of impeachment? In other words, they determine whether there's enough evidence to go to trial. Well, the Senate is where the trial takes place. The Senate has to vote on whether or not to convict the president. And the Senate has to vote not by a simple majority, but by a 2/3 majority in order to convict the president of a crime and kick him out of office. If the Senate cannot reach a 2/3 majority, then that means that the president stays in office and is not kicked out. Section 4 basically says that the states are in charge of running elections. That's it. They're in charge of running the elections. It's not the federal government, so things are done on a state and local level. The end. Now, Section 5 of Article 1 of the Constitution basically says that the House of Representatives is in charge of coming up with their own procedures and rules for how the House works, and the Senate is in charge of coming up with their own procedures and rules for how the Senate works. That's it. Though there is one important detail that we need to mention, which is the House and the Senate both have to publish what they do. So the different votes that they have, and also the different debates and things, and different procedures or rules that they put in place, it has to be published from time to time. The only exception being if we're dealing with national secrets. Obviously, if there's some sort of classified meeting, that does not need to be published. But other than that, there needs to be transparency with the American people. So the things that happen in the House and the Senate need to be published. So Section 6 of Article 1 of the Constitution states that no member of the House or the Senate can be arrested except for treason, breach of the peace, or a felony. If they commit any of those, they can be arrested. Now, you may be asking yourself, wait a second, why does that need to be in the Constitution? Well, in countries where there is less freedom, it tends to be that political groups in the minority will get arrested for disagreeing or voting against the majority opinion or voting against what the executive wants. So this is in place so that senators and congressmen, that would be the name for members of the House, so senators and congressmen can actually state their opinions, can actually do their job, and whether they agree with the majority opinion or disagree, they don't have to fear being arrested and losing their freedom simply for disagreeing with the government. Also, Section 6 states that while you are a member of the House of Representatives or the Senate, you cannot hold another office in the government. You have to only do that job, which makes sense. The last thing you want is a conflict of interest where you're holding a government office in, say, the judicial branch, but then you're also a member of the House. Okay, that wouldn't be fair. You certainly shouldn't be able to hold an office in the executive branch, and then also you're a senator. So, if you're a senator or a congressman, guess what? That's the only office in the government that you can hold until you're out of office. Section 7 of Article 1 states that all spending bills have to start in the House of Representatives. Now, this goes back to the Connecticut Compromise that we talked about that split the legislature into two houses. To sweeten the deal for the larger states who wanted representation based on population, they said, hey, the House of Representatives, which is based on population, that is where all spending bills will start because, after all, being a larger state, you probably have more things that you need to spend money on. Therefore, you get a little bit more control of the purse strings. Even though that spending bill still needs to pass through the Senate, it must start at the House. Also, the legislature can override the president's veto. So, if a president doesn't like a bill and he vetoes it, the House of Representatives and the Senate, if they can get 2/3 of their members to vote for that bill, then it will override the president's veto. And by the way, that's 2/3 in both houses. Section 8 has a lot of different parts to it. So, in no particular order, the legislature can collect taxes and create new taxes. The legislature can borrow money. The legislature can vote on trade deals with other countries. The legislature can pass naturalization and immigration laws. Also, the legislature has the power to create lesser federal courts. Now, the Supreme Court is created in Article 3 of the Constitution, dealing with the judicial branch. But the creation of lower courts, in other words, courts that are not as powerful as the Supreme Court, but lead up to the Supreme Court, that is under the jurisdiction of the legislature. So, when we get to the judicial branch, we'll talk about the Federal Court of Appeals, which is a level underneath the Supreme Court, and we'll also talk about the federal district courts, which are a level underneath the Court of Appeals. All of that is created and controlled by Congress. Also, Congress has the power to declare war. Now, the president is the head of the military. He is the commander-in-chief. But the official declaration of war has to come from Congress. This keeps the President of the United States from becoming just a general that goes and starts conquering and nobody can stop him. In other words, he can defend the United States, but he has to get the declaration of war from the legislature. Section 9 is all of the things that the legislature cannot do. Now, again, in no particular order, the legislature cannot ban the slave trade until 1808. That was part of that compromise with the southern states to keep them in the United States. The slave trade can be banned in 20 years, which the slave trade was banned in 1808. The legislature cannot suspend habeas corpus. Habeas corpus means your right to a trial, unless there is a rebellion or there is an invasion. Probably the most famous case of this would be during the Civil War, which would be a rebellion. If you think about it, the southern states are breaking away from the north. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus for that time until the Civil War was over. the legislature cannot engage in ex post facto laws. Now, if you're thinking, Mr. McGee, why all of a sudden all this Latin? Hey, such is life. Now, ex post facto means that once a law is passed, you can't go back and prosecute people for doing something that wasn't illegal to begin with. So think of it this way. If Congress passed a bill and it was signed by the president, became a law, and that bill banned all people from eating at Chick-fil-A. All right, by the way, I love Chick-fil-A. Great place. So if the president signs into law the banning of people eating at Chick-fil-A, everyone who has eaten at Chick-fil-A in the past cannot be arrested because it wasn't illegal to eat at Chick-fil-A. Only people who now eat at Chick-fil-A after the law was passed, they can be arrested. Think of it this way. When slavery was banned, nobody who owned slaves in the past was arrested on charges of slavery because slavery had been legal at the time. Now, after the ban on slavery in the 13th Amendment, if someone decided to enslave someone or engaged in any form of slave trading, they could be arrested because now they are violating a law. Hopefully that makes sense. Also, Congress cannot pass bills of attainder. A bill of attainder means that there cannot be a law passed declaring someone guilty. Guilt or innocence has to be done through the judicial branch. Congress cannot say, hey, we've decided to vote, this person is guilty. We declare them guilty. None of that can exist. Only the judicial branch has that power. Congress cannot tax exports, only imports. That's part of another compromise that happened during the Constitutional Convention between the southern states and the northern states. Congress must also record all withdrawals of money from the Treasury, which is very important considering all the debt that we're in today. Also, Congress can pass no titles of nobility. So, unfortunately, my dream of becoming Lord McGee, that's actually out. Congress cannot give out knighthoods or earldoms or dukedoms or anything like that. There are no titles of nobility. That is one thing that we did not want coming into our new country from England. That idea of, oh hey, you've got this kind of higher, more powerful class of citizens, and then you've got kind of a lower class. No, we're all equal under the law, and we're going to keep it that way. Section 10, the last section. What the states cannot do. A state legislature cannot make a treaty with another country. A state legislature also cannot form alliances with other states. There are no state alliances. All states are treated equally under the law, and they must operate as individual states, not, hey, let me team up with my buddy against somebody else. States cannot engage in war unless they are invaded. So in other words, the state of Virginia cannot declare war on France. But if France were to launch a surprise attack in Virginia, Virginia can mobilize and fight. They don't have to wait for the federal government to give them the go-ahead. If you have made it to the end, I congratulate you. As I said before, and I'm going to say it again in the next video, understanding the Constitution is so important to understanding not only how the government works, but understanding when some politician or some political entity says, hey, the country should do this, or the country isn't allowed to do this. You need to know, is that true or is it not? So, as I said in the executive branch video, I encourage you, go look at the Constitution. It's online. You can also buy a little booklet for yourself. Read it and understand it for yourself. So I hope that this video has given you a little push into understanding a little bit more of the Constitution, and hopefully you will read it for yourself. As per the usual, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them politely and respectfully in the description box below. I'm Mr. McGee. Take care.